Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Harry Truman, and the focus is a heartbeat away. The year is 1944. It's an election year. Franklin Roosevelt looks like he's going to run for an unprecedented fourth term. But Franklin Roosevelt is not doing well. He had aged considerably during these last 4 years of the war. He was committed. He felt it was his duty to run again, to finish off the war, get the peace process going. But party leaders were very concerned that Roosevelt was not going to live out that fourth term after he won it. And one thing they did not want was Henry Wallace as president of the United States. Roosevelt had handpicked Wallace to become the VP back in 1940, but the party leaders really had never supported him, didn't think he deserved the role then. He was too erratic. He was far too liberal, almost communistic in his thinking. He was opposed by the South. A lot of folks trying to convince Roosevelt, you can't stick with Wallace, you got to go somewhere else. Where else to go? How about James Byrnes? Byrnes actually wanted the position, even kind of expected it. At one point, Roosevelt had referred to him as his assistant president. He had gotten Byrnes to step down from the Supreme Court to run the Office of War Mobilization, a critical position during the war, and he did that duty. Again, he was very interested in the role, but the party leaders again had concern. Whereas Wallace was too liberal, Byrnes was too conservative. Again, the folks in the South had some problems with him, although the labor leaders also had concerns about Byrnes. They kept trying to get new names into the mix. What about Speaker Sam Rayburn from the House of Representatives? The Senate Majority Leader Alben Barkley was talked about. William Douglas, the Supreme Court Justice who had worked previously in the Roosevelt administration, their names were in the mix, as was Harry Truman. Who was pushing for Truman? Well, one of the people was Bob Hannegan. We talked in the previous episode about how Hannegan had helped Truman's re-election back in 1940 to the Senate. Well, Truman had returned the favor and helped Hannegan get the job as the head of the Bureau of Internal Revenue, and then this new job that he just took over as the chair of the Democratic Party. Also in Truman's camp was Ed Flynn, political boss from the Bronx, knew Roosevelt really well, and this is the way Flynn put it. Truman's record as head of the Senate committee was excellent. His labor votes in the Senate were good. On the other hand, he seemed to represent to some degree the conservatives in the party. He came from a border state. He had never made any racial remarks. He just dropped into the slot. Couple of issues. Roosevelt did not know Truman all that well, so that was a little bit of a concern, but the bigger issue was Truman didn't want the job. He started hearing his name in the mix, and he was going around town telling folks, I'm not interested. He told reporter Ed Harris that I'm content just where I am. Happy in the Senate, I have my friends, I don't have any political ambitions. He went on a little bit later to say the vice president simply presides over the Senate and sits around hoping for a funeral. It's a very high office which consists entirely of honor. I don't have any ambition to hold an office like that. Seemed extremely genuine, did not want the job. The big meeting took place on July the 11th of 1944, about a week before the convention. It's at the White House. Roosevelt is there. Hannegan is there. Flynn, other party leaders like Ed Pauley from California. And they're going through the list and they're basically rejecting people one after another, except Truman. His name seems to still be pretty prominent. One of the other key elements for Truman was that he was very popular on both sides of the aisle in the Senate. Now, this could be really important as the president of the Senate, one of the roles of the vice president, is in a treaty negotiations. When Roosevelt's going to negotiate a treaty to end World War II, he wanted to get it passed in the Senate, unlike Woodrow Wilson, who negotiated a treaty to end World War I, and the Senate rejected it. They never signed on to the Treaty of Versailles. Roosevelt didn't want to repeat. Perhaps Harry Truman, popular in the Senate, could help get that through. So they left the meeting on July the 11th, leaning in the direction of Harry Truman. Well, Hannegan actually wanted to get it in writing, so he asked Roosevelt to put something down, and he hand wrote a note, Bob, I think Truman is the right man, FDR. Why did he get it in writing? Well, a couple of reasons. Number one, Roosevelt was well known for telling one group one thing and turning around and telling another group another. And Hannegan didn't want that to happen. Number two is that Roosevelt also had a lot of trouble telling people bad news, and he was afraid, Hannegan was afraid that Roosevelt wasn't going to be able to turn down Wallace or Byrnes. So this plays forward. He had other people go out, reach out to Wallace, reach out to Byrnes, and tell them, I'm sorry, but you're out of the VP race. Well, neither one accepted that. They said, look, if Roosevelt doesn't want us in there, he's going to have to tell them themselves. And successively, they went on and met with Roosevelt one-on-one. And Roosevelt basically began to waffle. He actually gave Wallace a letter that said, if I was a delegate to the convention, I'd vote for you. Now, of course, the delegates can vote for anybody they want, but I would vote for you. So Wallace felt good about that. What about Byrnes? Well, Roosevelt basically said, oh, don't get out of the race. You're definitely still at the top of the list. Keep on going along. So he thought it was going to be him. Now, Byrnes was pretty savvy, maybe a chance to take Truman out of the mix. He called Truman and said, look, FDR's in my corner for the vice presidency. Would you nominate me, Mr. Truman, at the convention? And Truman said, sure. Well, Alben Barkley, by the way, also called Truman and asked him to nominate him. He said, no, I've already committed to nominating Byrnes. Well, Roosevelt was not going to be at the convention in Chicago. He was on his way to Hawaii to meet with his military leaders to talk about strategy of the war in the Pacific. But on his way, his train stopped in Chicago. He never got off the train. Hannegan came to meet with him and they talked about the VP spot, went back and forth, and they confirmed in Roosevelt's mind it should be Truman. He got another letter from him. This time the letter said, you have written me about Harry Truman and Bill Douglas. I wish I should, of course, be very glad to run with either of them and believe that either of them would bring real strength to the ticket, leaning again with the Truman name listed first. So what did this all mean? Well, Roosevelt was on his way. Truman was now arriving in Chicago, and Truman was finding out from everybody that he was going to be the VP. He was hearing it from party leaders. He was hearing it from labor leaders. Again, he's telling people, I don't want this job. He actually goes to Byrnes and said, look, James Byrnes, this is what I'm hearing. What's going on here? And Byrnes said, oh, don't worry. It's just a lot of rumor. It's a lot of noise. I'll call the president. We'll straighten this out. Well, this time Roosevelt would not take Byrnes' calls. He wouldn't call him back. Byrnes knew what that meant. He was bitter about it. In fact, he never really got over that bitterness, even though he served in the Truman administration. He left the campaign, or rather left the convention, and again, he withdrew from the whole contest. Now, for Hannegan, he showed this letter that he got from the president to Truman, and Truman is still not convinced. He's still not sure he wants this thing, and one of the reasons is we find out he had a little bit of a skeleton in his closet that he hadn't told anybody about. He told his friend Tom Evans, who he had to actually come to Chicago to help him sort this out, and he said, look, I got a problem. I had put my wife, Bess Truman, on the payroll on my Senate staff. And she really didn't do all that much work. I don't want this to come out in the vice presidential campaign. It would embarrass her. Now, other congressmen had done very similar kinds of things, but Truman was very sensitive to it. And again, for many other reasons, he still did not want the position. Well, the day before the ballots were going to be cast in Chicago, it's July the 19th now, Truman is invited to come to Hannegan's suite in the Blackstone Hotel. All the party leaders are there, and they're all trying to convince Truman he's got to get on board. He's continuing to be obstinate. So what does Hannegan do? He calls Roosevelt. There's a lot of different versions of this phone call, but Truman's version is as follows, and he heard it because Hannegan made the call and he put the receiver out so everybody in the room could hear Roosevelt's booming voice. According to Truman's version, Roosevelt said, Bob, have you got that fellow lined up yet? Hannegan, no, he is the contrariest Missouri mule I've ever dealt with. Roosevelt, well, you tell him if he wants to break up the Democratic Party in the middle of a war, that's his responsibility, and he hung up the phone. Everybody got quiet, everybody looked at Truman, and Truman finally said, well, if that's the situation, I'll have to say yes, but why the hell didn't he tell me in the first place? So Truman's now going to get on board. The next day, Roosevelt is nominated by acclamation, no issue there, but Wallace still thinks he's in the running, and when they get to the VP vote, Wallace has his supporters kind of storm the floor, kind of a big show of support for Wallace, and the party leaders got really concerned. They shut the whole thing down. They went into recess, wanted to reset the next day, and they kept a whole lot of those Wallace supporters out of the hall. This time, Wallace actually still led on the first ballot for vice president, but by then, Hannegan had shown people this letter and made clear the intentions of the president, and by the second ballot, Truman goes over the top. He becomes the Democratic nominee for Vice President of the United States. He's brought up on stage, big cheers. He gives a very brief acceptance speech, heads back to Washington, D.C., resigns from the Truman Committee, not from the Senate, but from the committee. Didn't feel he could be running for national office and be leader of a bipartisan committee at the same time. So he does that. He has a lunch set up for him with Roosevelt outdoors at the White House, which was actually a day of concern. He comes back to his Senate office. He tells Harry Vaughn in the office that, look, his hands were shaking. He talks with considerable difficulty, talking about Roosevelt. It doesn't seem to be any mental lapse of any kind, but physically, he's just going to pieces. Well, The campaign, it's really all about the top of the tickets. It's not about the vice presidential candidates. It is about FDR and about the Republican nominee, Governor of New York, Thomas Dewey, and they're doing the main stuff for the campaign. The Democrats did ask Truman to get out there and stump. He gets on his train, gives about 50 speeches. A lot of it's in the South. Not really talking about himself. He's talking about FDR. One of the things he's trying to point out is the difference between Roosevelt and Dewey at this critical time in the world. The war's coming to an end. We got to win the war. We got to win the peace. This is going to be complicated. You need experience. Experience matters. He said on the stump, it takes time for anyone to familiarize himself with a new job. This is particularly true of the presidency of the United States, the most difficult and complex in the world. We cannot expect anyone wholly inexperienced in national and international affairs to readily learn the views, the objectives, and the inner thoughts of such divergent personalities as those dominant leaders who have guided the destinies of our courageous allies. There will be no time to learn, and mistakes once made cannot be unmade. Now, ironic in this statement, given what would happen with Truman becoming president in just a few months, given his lack of experience in these areas, but now on the stump in 1940, he's making the point, you got to go with Roosevelt. Dewey's not experienced enough, therefore not qualified. Well, this would be the closest of FDR's 4 presidential races, but in the end, it wasn't really that close. Roosevelt, Truman, they win the Electoral College 432 to 99. They capture 53% of the popular vote. Roosevelt is going to be president for the 4th time. Harry Truman's going to be the Vice President of the United States. Now, the inaugural, January 20th, 1945, is actually kind of a subdued affair. It was snowing in Washington. Roosevelt's under the weather. They moved it from the Capitol to the White House. It was kind of a smaller crowd, very brief. A couple of days later, Roosevelt's back on the road again. He's got a meeting in Yalta for the Big Three, working with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, trying to figure out the situation in Europe. Comes back, gives a speech in Congress. Harry Truman, of course, is there, and Truman says, I saw the president immediately after his speech had been concluded. Plainly, he was a very weary man. Truman, as vice president, he would sit in on cabinet meetings. He would go to a couple of meetings with the president, mostly talking about things going on in the Senate, but really had no role in the administration. He was not brought in under the covers on practically anything. Now, this was typical of the time. Up until this point in the nation's history, the vice president typically did not have a big role in the administration. They were the president of the Senate, and frankly, that was the part of the job that Truman was really enjoying in these first couple of months. He had his friends there, he was respected there, the work wasn't hard, his social calendar was kind of full. He and Bess were going out on the town for dinners many nights a week. Things were basically all good. 82 days into Roosevelt's 4th term. It's April the 12th of 1945. A normal day for Harry Truman. He's presiding on the dais of the Senate. Getting to the end of the day, they go into recess just before 5 o'clock. He heads over to the House side of the Capitol, where he goes to Speaker of the House Sam Rayburn's hideaway to have some drinks and chatting with some friends and colleagues. Everything is going to be fun and fine for the evening, and he gets a message from Steve Early, the press secretary to President Roosevelt. He gets up the phone, takes a call, and then Truman's Secret Service agent later recalled this is what Truman said to the room when he hung up the phone. Jesus Christ and General Jackson. Steve Early wants me at the White House immediately. Boys, this is in the room. Keep this quiet. Something must have happened. Quickly, Truman's going to get to the car. In fact, there's some reports that he actually ran across the Capitol to get to his car, although he reportedly stopped at his office to get his hat. He then makes the quick drive to the White House, goes up to the residence, goes to a sitting room where he finds the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, and her daughter, Anna Roosevelt. And Eleanor Roosevelt gets right to the point. Mr. Truman, the president is dead. Truman responds, is there anything I can do for you? And Mrs. Roosevelt says, is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now. With that ominous thought ringing in his ears, Harry Truman was about ready to prepare to become the 33rd President of the United States. And that's the story for another day. That's Harry Truman, and a heartbeat away from the life of Harry Truman. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com. Don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.